My name is Jean-Thomas Martelly. I'm a researcher in political science and sociology here at CSH. On behalf of the CSH, or the Center for Social Science and Humanities, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all for our 8th seminary lecture series session that covers historical and contemporary issue in India. We, as a center, the Center for Social Science and Humanities ambitions to be a truly multidisciplinary forum for a wide range of scholars. So for instance, in 15 days, since this is a bi-monthly event, we'll receive Nilesh Bose, who will present his book, South Asian Migration Global History. But today we welcome Margherita Trento. Margherita is a postdoctoral researcher at the CES, the Centre d'études de l'Inde et de l'Asie du Sud. She's a recipient of a Marie Curie Fellowship. She did a PhD in South Asian language and civilization from the University of Chicago. She was also in Napoli all'Orientale, part of a ERC of a European Research Council grant. She's currently working as a postdoctoral fellow on her book manuscript titled Writing Tamil Catholicism, A Social History of Persuasion and Devotion in the 18th century. And I believe today she would be presenting part of this academic endeavor. In particular, Margherita would be focusing on the way Tamil Catholic literature penetrated, infused the broader Tamil literary sphere in the 18th century, with a particular focus on Costanzo Giuseppe Beschi and his body of literary work. So Margherita, without further delay, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jean-Thomas, and thank you everyone for inviting me here. I wish I could be physically in that room, perhaps in the near future. But for the time being, I'm very content and happy to be in this virtual room with you and to be talking about, Jean-Thomas was saying, what is part of my book to be, soon to be. And the title of my talk today is Reading Tamil Catholic Literature in the 18th Century. I will try to share a PowerPoint now. We tried before. And let me know if all of you can see it correctly. That's good. So, as the title shows, and as you might also have read in the abstract on the CSH website, what I would like to explore today is a history of readers and practices of reading among Tamil Catholics in South India. But before actually delving into this main question of my talk, the question of reading, I thought I would give you a short overview of the larger context of the question and of the presentation, which is precisely the history of the Jesuit missions to Tamil-speaking South India and of the textual practices connected to it, which is a little bit the general topic of my research. So you see here a map. The map, it's a nice historic map from 1701. It represents South India, and where there are villages and cities represented, it's more or less the area of the Jesuit missions to this area. I say missions in the plural because there were at least 3. The mission along the fishery coast and among Paravar fishermen, the Madurai mission, into which was spread over more or less the all inland Tamil Nadu as we know of it today, and the third very small mission at the border with Kerala, the Nemau mission. But what I will be really focusing on today is the Madurai mission, the Jesuit mission to the inland, and the dark spots here are mapping some of its main center. You can see that it is in the inland and mostly also, let's say, along the Kaveri Delta between Trichy and Tanjore, just to localize the space we're talking about. As for the centuries, the mission, the Paravar mission, the mission of the coast, started early in the 16th century. The Madurai mission started in the early 17th and went through all the way to the half/end of the 18th century. Catholic textual practices, I mean Catholic reading and writing of texts, were quite intense from the very beginning. Here you have a very, very basic timeline. Missionaries teaching took the form of oral sermons and catechetical instruction. So the oral part was important, but there was always there were also from very soon written catechisms and devotional books. So the slide here has a list of the most important Catholic writers from the 16th to the 19th century. Of course, there are many more in the 19th century. It's not really my period. I just cited some quick names. What I argue in general in my dissertation, in the book that I'm preparing, is that even though missionaries started to write texts very early on, it is only in the 18th century and with the Costanzo Giuseppe Beschi that they started writing by using Tamil literary genres. So it is at this point, after more than a century of Catholic presence in South India, that Catholic literature finally really entered the Tamil literary sphere. And I just put in bright yellow the name of Beschi so that you can identify him immediately. After him, and more or less at the same time as him, there are also local laymen, Catholic intellectuals, who began writing more or less in the same refined genres. So the 18th century is really a key moment for all of this, for literary transformations from many points of view. And you see here on the left, actually, a picture of Beschi. As we said, with him, Tamil Catholic literature entered for the first time the Tamil literary sphere. And on the left of the slide, you see an early representation of him as a Pulavar, a Tamil poet scholar, taken from his earliest biography by Muthuswami Pillai, who was published in 1840 in English. So the text basically composed he composed several texts in different genres, but his masterpiece and the text to which he really owns his fame is the epic poem Tembavani, a poem on the life of Saint Joseph. And I mentioned this title, Tembavani, literally meaning either an unfading garland or a cluster of sweet flowers. There is a pun in the title. I mention it because I will be saying this name again and again. It will be a little bit the center of the reflection today, but not so much because I will be exploring why and how Beschi wrote it or when, but we will be exploring a little bit the history of how people read it, who read it, and how. And just anecdotally, actually, this is a big question this is a question that I was asked so many times after I started studying this topic, and Beschi specifically, in the sense that this body of literature is rather complex for like any standards. At the same time, it's very difficult Tamil poetry, and it is rather arcane Catholic poetry of the early modern period, with stories that are quite difficult to trace, etc. So very often people would ask me who could actually read and enjoy this, who would have all the cultural tools to read it. And wasn't this perhaps the result of the mind of one crazy genius, that is, would be Beschi, all alone in his hut somewhere in his village along the banks of the Kaveri? I took this question quite seriously, and it took me a very long time to articulate a strong answer, which is also one of my main arguments here. And the short answer is that yes, there was a readership. People read this text. These were laymen working in the mission, mostly as catechists, that is, both as preachers and leaders of local Catholic communities. They were elite, educated men, responsible for the education of other Catholics. They were not the big intellectuals we read about who worked in courts, but they were part of what Shulman, Narayana Rao, and Sanjay Subramaniam have at some point called Karnam culture. It's like a small town intelligentsia, we could say. And they were actually extremely important for the mission. And missionary put a lot of efforts in converting, educating these men so that they could actually manage the mission and spread it on a capillary level. And the other image you see on the same slide is one such man working in the Church of Caracal and actually teaching a class. And in his hand, I think he has what is a stylized version of an ole, a palm leaf manuscript, but he is a catechist from one of this high caste, Velala caste, as the inscription in Tamil and French says. And this is exactly a representation of the kind of people who would be socially the readers of these poems. And as I said, let's say in the period that I'm interested in this early 18th century, when missionaries started to write actual Tamil poetry, it's also the time when they put even a more structured effort in the instruction of this group of people. So between 1718 and 1730s, we have at least two big enterprises. One, a set of like they institute spiritual retreats for these catechists, so they could actually practice the spiritual exercises by Ignatius. We don't have any information about actually non-Jesuits practicing this in the mission before this time, but we understand that from this point onwards, missionaries wanted these collaborators to have the kind of spiritual training that the exercises would afford them, the ability to discern in certain situations and so on. We'll go back to it. And second, in around 1730, they also instituted a school of classical Tamil. So the responsible was Beschi, but again, at this time, we do have missionaries who actually want to teach these catechists to read Tamil poetry, and to read it in a very specific way, which is a Christian way, and in relationship also to the new poetry that Beschi and then other people after him are producing starting from this time. So this is the general context. We're talking of the Jesuit mission to South India. It started very early in the 18th century. The catechists were important from the very beginning, but from the 18th century onwards, we do have a renewed interest in their education, especially in their spiritual education. Today, building upon this kind of sketch, this picture that I've just given you, I want to slightly switch the focus and go beyond missionaries who were writers and their ways of training their catechists to be readers, which is somehow what we've been talking thus far, to understand possible practices, that is at the same time tactics and strategies of reading in connection with this corpus of Tamil Catholic literature that begins, that somewhat begins around this time, the early 18th century. And the focus will be the Tembavani, as I said, this epic poem written by Beschi, and what I want to, what are the questions which I want to start is who read the Tembavani in the 18th century and partially in the early 19th century? How did they read it? What were the reactions to the text? How did it enter everyday life? And so on. So the rest of the presentation, I guess another half an hour roughly, will be devoted to answering this question: who and how read this text from different perspectives, and using a little bit of, let's say, an eclectic methodology. I mean, I'm going to somehow try to answer the same question using at each step a different type of sources. So first, I will start by reading together with you all the text itself. We will look at a couple of verses from the Tembavani, so we understand what it is, just to have an idea, but also we start looking at what the text expects of its readers. So what are the skills? What are the kind of knowledge that the text itself requires in order to be read? Then we will get out of the text and begin looking at some manuscripts of the Tembavani from 2 points of view. On the one hand, the history of the circulation, what are when the text was copied, when it was printed, and on the other hand, we will briefly look at some of its paratexts, that is all of these textual materials that surround the text, that allow us to enter into and come out of the text. I'm talking about satellite stanzas, prefatory verses, colophons, annotations, commentaries. So we will be thinking about this. Third, we will mention very briefly some catechist family histories and diaries, which are quite exceptional documents in which the protagonists tell us in their own voice what they were doing with the Tembavani. These are quite rare sources, but we do have some information on really even singular acts of reading and copying the text. And then we will end on some reactions and controversies surrounding the text and some colonial appropriations that kind of point to ways of reading the text outside this immediate community that I've been trying to talk about, that I've begun to delineate, this Catholic catechists and elite laymen in the mission. All the way to the early colonial period. And in the conclusions, I will just briefly go back and think about a couple of ways in which this approach helps us both to understand the history of a mission in another perspective, a little bit also the social history of this area of Tamil-speaking South India at this time, and the interaction of literary and religious practices in this context. So this is a little bit the plan. So let's start directly with the text. I will be reading we will be reading a couple of verses together in English, but I'll be happy to comment on the text if there is anyone who would like to. So as I said, the Tembavani is an epic poem. It tells the story of Saint Joseph, the father of Jesus, in an extremely elaborated manner. People like to repeat that the text has 3,615 stanzas. So, and each of them has 4 lines. So this is a big text. And this first verse that I've chosen is from the second canto, where the text describes the city of Jerusalem. There is this basic mechanism at play in the Tembavani, that is the Holy Land is described as if it was South India. So there is this basic accommodation at play in the text. I'll be happy to talk about it and what it means later on in the discussion, etc. Here I will just try to point at some specific elements in the text, in the verse, that point at habits of reading. So I'll read the English very quickly. Similar to the type of attachment of those people who give without interruptions, as if they were saying, proceed, come, and experience the great riches here which hide no evil, on top of the mansions that shine with gems without any impurities, the large waving banners seem to invite the people in. So here we have a verse comparing, talking about the banners, the flags on top of the houses in Jerusalem. And there are two rhetorical figures at play in the verse. The first line compares this to people who give without interruptions. And it's somehow like could be a standard reference to the Christian quality of charity, but it also quite a clear echo of a number of verses in one of the most important ethical text in Talmud, the Tirukural, that emphasizes the importance of giving. So we have here a reference to a text of classical Talmud literature that Besky knew very well, that it also probably translated into Latin. The second half of the verse is a bit more complex. It's built around a specific figure in Tamil, which is called Tarkure Petravani. It's also a Sanskrit figure called flight, sometimes translated as a flight of fancy. And the idea is that we imagine that inanimate things have feelings or opinions. And in this case, it seems like the banners are doing something. They're asking people to come in. This image is per se nice, but what it is really doing here, it's actually a paraphrase of one of the most famous verses of lines of Tamil literature from the Silapadiharam, in which it's a tragic story in which a couple enters the city of Madurai, and the banners at the entrance try to tell them, don't come in, you are gonna end your life here, everything is gonna get a mess. And here we have basically a citation of that extremely famous passage, but inverted, in which the poem tells us, come in here, there is no problem, everything is gonna be fine. So this, among all the things that we could say about this verse, its formal aspect that already presuppose an extremely good knowledge of Tamil poetry through those kind of trainings that I was mentioning you about before. What I wanted to say here is that the text itself is in a way an exercise in reading. It's an exercise in reading Tamil classics, but it also requires the reader to do the same exercise. That is, to understand the world of Tamil poetry, to put it in relationship with these verses that make no sense without it, but also at the same time to understand what the Christian layering and interpretation of it is doing at this point in the text. So this kind of exercise that we will go back to at the end. So an exercise in reading Tamil literature in dialogue with, partial opposition with, but also in somewhat this creative tension with Catholic poetry, is, I think, one of the most important expectation of these texts from the readers. I will now quickly go to another couple of verses. I'll spend a bit less time here, I guess, because they actually point to a completely different set of requirements. And these are from a much later point in the poem. It's about the flight into Egypt. Here Joseph is in Egypt, is trying to convert people. Once again, Egypt is somehow Tamil Nadu. And all of these conversations are really a sort of ventriloquism of real missionary conversations. And this one is one that I like very much, in which basically is speaking with an old lady called Surumi, who cannot let go of her beliefs. She doesn't understand why she should believe this new preacher and this new religion. And these two verses are about the moment where, after listening to him, she goes back home, and she meets him, and she starts dreaming. And perhaps we won't even have time to actually read them line by line, but in the first verse she meets in this luxuriant large garden where peacocks are dancing, the honey is dripping, the god she worshipped, and the turn of phrase, he went to meet her as the god she worshipped, is a little bit difficult to understand without the previous passage, but because this is a demon according to Besky. So he is representing a demon, using the word pei in Tamil, that really identify a class of demons, disguising himself as a god and going to meet this old lady in her dark dream. And as soon as she sees him in her dream, she falls, she worships him with her hands. And she asks him basically some questions. This, my translation here, it's also should be made clearer, but it's a bit too literal. But anyway, she's asking him, how can you be so powerful and not be able to oppose Joseph? So why the fact that I think you are God is making me suffer so much? And she falls to his feet, she worships him, and he stands in front of her, this demon turned God, like a flash of light, and starts talking to her. And this episode, the whole scene here, I just selected this passage, we'll see in a minute why, but the whole scene really points to at least two parallel and important aspects, I think, of both of the life of catechists and missionaries at this time, but also two kind of fields of knowledge that were necessary to understand Tamil Catholic literature at this time. The first is the word of like possession. In fact, what this passage is all about, this dream, the god, that the demon that comes disguised in a dream, after this passage starts a long description of an episode of possession in which this pei doesn't abandon the old woman and makes her do all sorts of crazy things, in which she tries to kill Joseph. Actually, she dies mad, with like rolling on the ground, with a real, somehow almost realistic description of what perhaps is possession by an evil god. And so we have here somewhat a representation of Tamil village practices, but what this is really talking to, I think, is the important role that practices of possession, but also exorcism, played in building Catholic religious authority in South India. Catholic priests, but also their catechists, very much so, were considered specialists in driving away demons, peis, all of the set of beings that would actually possess people, and especially women, and especially old women, in Tamil villages at this time, and to a certain extent today too. But really, the power of exorcism is one of the main powers that true missionaries, catechists, are endowed with. And this comes up in several occasions. It's also an interesting topic per se. But actually, this whole description somewhat speaks to this, to the ability of reading what's happening, and to the inner knowledge that that the Catholic reader has a response to this. And this response is partially articulated in this passage through this grammar of like light and darkness. That is, the woman has a dark dream, as her heart is dark, and then the Pei is disguised as a god. He is a ray of light. The garden is light. And because she has a dark heart, she cannot see that this light is a lie. This is really a recasting of the theme of the discernment of the spirits. I think the very famous Ignatian's phrase is, the devil can come disguised as an angel of light. And so we have here both a problem, a practice, a social context, and somehow woven into the text, a suggestion for actually dealing with it, which is the question of discernment, to see what is the right and what it's not, to see what darkness does in all of this kind of situation. And in order to really understand this passage, one needs to be reading this language of discernment also into the text. So we stop here with the Tembavani, but just to recap, the text itself really kind of presupposes readers which are familiar with the classical Tamil literature, who can read it, who are like immersed in a world of village practices, but who can again read them through some spiritual tools which are drawn from Ignatian spirituality. And all of this really points once again to what I was talking about in the beginning, which is these two great training institutions of training that began around this time: spiritual exercises in the retreats and the Tamil school. So now we get out from the text. We won't go back to it again, and we actually start looking at its manuscript circulation. So just to answer the question who read it, how, and so on, simply the fact that there are manuscripts of the Tembavani, quite a bit. They do mostly come from the first half of the 19th century, and they drop in number exponentially after the 19th century, when the text was first printed. But we do have a very ancient and the most authoritative manuscript of the poem, which is the one you see in the picture. It was written down in 1729, while Beschi was still alive. It's a thick paper volume. It's now in the British Library. And it already contains all the paratexts that traditionally go with the Tembavani. That is an introduction to the commentary, a colophon, some final closing verses. So the text doesn't come pure alone. Here it's already surrounded by all of these elements surrounding it that really point to the way it was read at this time. I should mention that this manuscript is a little bit at the center of a controversy, in the sense that it has many people believe this was an original copy written by Beschi, that Beschi wrote the text, wrote the commentary himself, and wrote both down in 1729 at La Curici. The origin of this story are early biographies of Beschi. But already in the 19th century, both Jesuit and non-Jesuit scholars were actually doubting this for several reasons. The handwriting and all of that, we won't go into it. But what it's pretty clear is that the voice of the person who writes the paratext, or who writes the introduction, who writes the commentary, it's not the same voice as Beschi's voice. He speaks about Beschi, whom he calls Virama Munivar, his Tamil name, in the third person. He talks about reading the poem and putting some effort in understanding it and all of that. So clearly it's a person who is writing this paratext as a way to approach the text. It must have been a student of Beschi, perhaps one of these catechists working with him, whom he was training in this school at La Curici, the village where he spent most of his life. What I want to do now is actually read you a little bit of a little passage from the introduction to the commentary, that talks about, in which this student talks about what kind of commentary he is writing and why he is writing it. So I'll quote. As for the Tembavani, says this introduction, in order to match this poem with a text of explanation and to give a clear summary of it, which would not deviate from the lines, literal lines of the poem, and yet afraid that all of this explanation would become too long if we consider that if you ask poets about their poems, they will tell you like how one word has many meanings, one meaning can be expressed by many words, they would never stop. This explanation that I'm writing, which has these two purposes, matching the poem and giving a clear summary, this explanation would only mention the meanings that are necessary. Learned men may understand and enjoy this poem fully, but for the illiterate to also experience, to gain the full fruits from this poem, my intention is to explain it in an accessible way here in the commentary. So this is the introduction to the commentary, which is clearly not by Deschi. And we have here a statement of intent that is the person who is writing this commentary wants to make this poem clear and accessible to normal people who would not be perhaps illiterate. Here it's somehow mostly referring to people who are illiterate in the ways of poetry. And this image, and so what I want you to notice here is that, in fact, this this commentator, which is probably somehow a first level reader of the Tembavani, is probably someone like this educated layman that we have been talking about so far. And by writing this commentary, you can see that their ways of reading is also a way of mediating. They do read the text that they understand, but they also mediate and explain it for devotees who would not be able to access it on their own. So here we find one layer, one important aspect of reading Catholic poetry and of the specific type of reading that this class, group, catechist, elite, educated layman was doing at this time, which is reading was an activity, one of their activities as mediators. How this mediation could happen in practice, we don't know very well because we don't have like records of how people read the text in the 18th century. But there are interesting records from later on, mid-19th century, where a Catholic poet from Pondicherry, Savarailu Nayakar, went on a tour reciting the Tembavani, and we do have colonial administrators talking about this tour and talking about how he went in front of churches and publicly recited some stanzas and then commented upon them with an elegant, I quote, and approachable style. So this is a little bit the idea. What this commentator is talking, I think, about something like that, about the idea of reading, in the sense reading, which at this time is really reading and reciting and performing, and the reading of the educated person who then passes on the text with easier word. And this second level reading is very often, I mean, at this time, a type of listening. So this, I think, emerges from this, the fact that this comment is there early on from 1729, when Beschi is still alive, points to the fact that this practice is begun very early, already in the 18th century. I told you that there are several manuscripts circulating. This is a copy of the Tembavani, which is in BNF. I think this slide was very heavy. Because these are very good quality pictures. These are the first folio of this copy in BNF. I put it here because, as I said, The poem circulated, people copied it, but what is really interesting in this specific version, which I cataloged, so I actually had to read it and confront it with compare it with the printed text, is that it has very, very, very marked variations, which is something, I'll come to it in a moment, people don't really, they don't really talk about very much. But the fact that these variations exist, in fact, is, I think, proof precisely of these kind of practices that I was talking about before, in the sense that the fact that the text was used, the fact that teachers used for teaching, that people read the commentary out loud for explaining, is also in other forms and other textual forms in Tamil Nadu, is one of the main sources of variations. Like the use, especially in teaching context, make it so that people actually update, correct, change. So actually the manuscript circulation also in a way points in that direction. All of this somehow ended, not completely, but took different forms in the mid-19th century when the text was printed. This early printed edition that remained Editio Princeps is made by someone who believed that copy I talked to you about, the 1729 copy, was the original. So basically this is a reprint of that. And from 1851 onwards, this has been the text of the Tembavani. Every other reprint is based on this, even though there are modern commentaries and all of that. And very often it's actually worse than this, because, you know, very often late reprints sometimes introduce some little mistakes. But this is just to say that it's difficult to recover this pre-1851 practices, because this edition was a big deal. But very quickly, moving on to the third type of sources, and I will gloss then a bit quicker also on the last things. But I want to spend some time on this. I was telling you before that we would look at the text as its manuscripts, and then look at actually how people, how catechists and Catholic, let's say, intellectuals, or anyway, Catholic leaders would talk about the text. And for doing so, I am using two documents which are quite exceptional, really very rare. You see both of them here, I mean, just fragments of them here. On the right is you see a genealogical record of the Velala family, of Velala catechist family of Vadakkankulam, who provided catechists for the village from the 18th century up to the early 20th. This document was compiled in 1915 from a Jesuit father who at that time belonged to this family, from local palm leaf record, etc. This family history is produced in context of violent litigation between different castes for control over Catholic places and rights in this small village called Vadakkankulam. So it has a very clear agenda of providing the ancient history and the deep ties of the Velala community with the location, and also give them this kind of like noble status by showing how they were connected to a translocal network of catechists throughout the Tamil country. That means we do have here the long genealogy of the main family of Vadakkankulam, and then we have genealogies for all the branches with which they were connected through marriage, and so on. And this document includes very little biographical sketches. In the lower part, you can see that the paper is divided into two of the various characters of the family. On the left, you have another document that I discovered recently, which is, but here you see the title page of the first printed edition of the journal. But this is the journal and the family history, so two different documents, compiled by 19th century Lutheran catechist Savariraya Pillai. But this man converted to Lutheranism in his 20s. He came originally from a Catholic family from a village called Kurivinattam, which was in fact connected through marriage with the Vadakankulam family. So in this document, in his journal and his family history, he just tells us about his ancestors who were Catholic and who appear also in the Arpudam genealogy. So we have two different parallel sources, one more like narrative and the other one genealogical, on the same family, this Kurivinattam Kudumbam, from this small village, which is not the main topic of the Vadakankulam document, but what is really interesting is that on this family, we can know the names, the relationship between the people, but also we have a lot of anecdotes and interesting information that Savariraja Pillai gives us. And among these, I'll just briefly tell you about the life of one person called Savarimuttu Pillai, who appears in both documents. An important figure for many reasons in the family. But what is interesting for us is that he was born in the early 18th century, and so he lived precisely at this time that is somewhat the focus of my research. And we know that his mother was very keen on his education. She sent him to school from early on, and these documents tell us she hired learned men who would read and explain to him the Tembavani and other difficult poems. So in this text, we do have actually an example of how people would approach this text. There would be learned men of the community who knew the poem, going to this young kid, reading it out loud to him, and then explaining it to him, certainly with the help of the commentary, but you can also see how the commentary could be changed and adapted by people such as these people who would copy it and perhaps have something to say about small details. It is thanks to this training that the men were following, Savarimuttu, went on to become a disciple of a priest, a Vadakankulam, then he ran away from home, went to the Maravar country, and ended up working as a catechist there and as a teacher until his death. So we have the Tembavani as being part of the early training, even independently from the missionary, from someone who has this sort of trajectory. But the more interesting detail is perhaps the story of his own copy of the Tembavani, which we also discover from these sources. He had the manuscript of the Tembavani, which he had copied himself. After his death, a thief came to the house and stole it. Soon after stealing it, he sold it again. He sold it off. The new owner immediately realized that the object must have been a family possession, perhaps because it was well copied, perhaps because there were notes from Savarimuttu. We don't know. What we know, and both sources tell us, is that he knew where the manuscript came from, and so he brought it to the son of Savarimuttu, called Maria Singham, and offered to sell it back to him. Of course, not for free because he had to pay for it, but the son, and here I quote directly from the diary, seeing that the palm leaf was in the handwriting of his father, he was astonished. He wondered how it could show up there, and bought it for the price asked without questioning it. Then the text tells us the whole story of this Maria Singham, who left the Tembavani to his wife's second wife's son, who gave it to his son, who gave it eventually to the son of the writer, to the son of Savariraja Pillai. What is interesting in this last passage is that, of course, this is a manuscript traveling within one family, but at some point there was a conversion. So the last owner of the manuscript was a Lutheran who still received as part of his inheritance this Catholic manuscript that traversed 5 generations, staying within the same family, but somehow changing confession. And then the last owner actually gave back the manuscript to the church with a ceremony in which they read it out loud and so on. So what I think it's kind of important here is to see how how the manuscript, how the text was part of the life of these people, how the manuscript and copying it was part of it, and how the text actually went even out of Catholic communities at this time. I had some things to say on controversies surrounding the text, but since most of the reactions are lost, we have very little of what non-Catholics thought about the Tembavani or anything Catholic at all. We can go back to it in the discussion if we're interested. It was mostly a history of losses of texts. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about was how we do see that the catechist, even in the context of colonial Madras, kind of shows us into poetry, and kind of creates this never-ending conversation in which, however, like the Christian somewhat retelling of most ethical points originally in the Turikural and then in the rest of the tradition is somewhat the culmination of all of this. I will conclude just by telling you 3 points that I think emerge from all of this and are interesting. But first of all, it's perhaps banal after 40 minutes I'm talking about it, but we really need to pay attention to this group of people, catechists, elite laymen, who were the readers we've been talking about today, who had all sorts of other roles in the mission. We talked briefly about exorcism, we talked about a whole lot of other things. But they do need they are crucial to understand how the mission developed, and then after the Jesuit mission ended in the 18th century, how Christianity kept being assimilated, and then like how communities dealt with and lived through the colonial period. And what I think is important is that in reading the Tembavani, we see how this group operated a double mediation. On the one hand, between Catholic literature and the world of Tamil poetry that they read and mobilized to explain it. And on the other hand, between the world of Catholic poetry and the world of the more common devotees, who would only be able to enjoy these poems and to read them thanks to their explanation. So their role as double mediators, I think, is crucial, and point also to their role in adapting Catholicism to Tamil culture. The question of adaptation has often been looked at from the perspective of the missionaries, but I do think that especially practices of reading, which sometimes are impromptu, they are like sometimes well-defined strategies. We saw some of them coming up, this idea of like reading classical text side to side to Christian text, but also they can be singing one poem next to another or with a certain intonation. I mean, there is a whole spectrum of practices that though were actually, I think, fundamental in this process of adaptation of Catholicism to Tamil culture, and that we understand a little bit better if we look at this group and their practices of reading. And with this, I look forward to questions, and I'm sorry I've taken a bit too much time, but I hope I was clear.
Of course, and thank you so much for such really rich and richly textured presentation. I'm sure we all learn a lot from it, and I'm equally sure that there will be questions from the audience, both those in Houston, aka CSH headquarters, and from the those who are participating to the meeting. So you could either I invite you all to either unmute yourself and ask your question, or raise your hand so that you can attract attention to me, or ask the question directly in the chat box. It's up to you. Right. So maybe start from Elsa Matthews. If Marita is back to her.
I see.
You are here.
Yeah.
Right.
Sure. Yeah, the text is from the 18th century, and it is written by a missionary, Costanzo Giuseppe Beschi. So, of course, I mean, as I said in the beginning, it is a mix, but it is really steeped in Catholic culture. So, I mean, it's a story of the Holy Family from the perspective of Joseph. It is a didactic work full of instructions for Christian ethical life, tons of stories from the Old Testament, and so yeah, definitely all of this is there. All of this is there, and is part of the two big words that somehow are necessary to master the text. At the same time, it's full of like long passages of natural description that are very much typical of Tamil poetry. The first chapter starts with, I don't remember how many verses on the rain, that starts from the top of a mountain and then falls through all the landscape of the Tamil land. So yeah, both aspects are there.
There's an additional question from Nicolas Bellorger.
Yeah.
Can I try finally?
Yeah, it works. It works, okay. Ines. It's fantastic.
So, Margarita, this was fantastic. I really enjoyed every moment, every word you said. So I will be just two small questions. One is that from what I see is you were basically talking about what Beschi, let's say, let's enter Beschi's head. He was looking he wanted to create a Tamil Catholic literary elite. So for that, he is creating this text, which then can proliferate just as his catechists will be proliferating and moving all around the Tamil country. Now, the thing is that not every Catholic, not every Tamil person in Tamil Nadu in Beschi's time or today can read classical literature, Tamil literature. So what is he doing? Is he, in a way, dumbing down? But what you are saying is basically he is lifting up this literary canon specifically for the Catholics. So he's in a way teaching Catholics classical literature, also Tamil classical literature. This is precisely the first reading we had with you of this fragment, in which actually a reader, a good reader, a proper reader should see that there is there are literary citations or winks to certain literary texts. So what I'm wondering, we know that we know what Nobili did, we know what Paravas, who Paravas are. So what kind of audience is Beschi exactly targeting? What kind of castes? Is it only Velala castes? What happens with conversion of the Dalits, because these exist? Would this text be also directed to Dalits, for example, Dalit Christians? How did this project, Beschi's project, really work out? Is that actually creation of some kind of not just literary elite, but political elite within the Catholic community? So that is one thing. And the second one is the story of stolen manuscript. I think that's an old topos in Tamil literature, or in many literatures, in which the stolen manuscript is kind of authorizing and authentifying you know, the originary text. And it may be all just bogus, but it's a kind of a strategy to control basically the origins of the community. So that's my text, and thank you so much for talking to us today.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. Basically, the first question, which I will summarize as the question of caste, is tricky. And I can only say certain things in the direction of answering. So first, I think basically was entering his head and just looking at what I've talked about today, but from his perspective and the missionary perspective, he was definitely trying to create a literary elite. He did it in several ways at once, like in the same decade. There was the school, there was this text that that became basically, it's a representation of the world as they should see it. And then there is a grammar, which I think is really the missing link, and perhaps the most important aspects to understand all of this. It takes I say grammar, but it's a very complex text that goes from what we would define in English as grammar to a treatise of poetics, etc. And actually, it's like in Tamil, a traditional grammar retells it kind of twisting things so that the aims of poetry, the role of poetry in relationship with the persuasion, in relationship with ethical life, becomes more in line with Christian ideas. It does so mostly by reshuffling existing pieces and elements of the grammatical tradition, but also inserting some translated bits and pieces from the Latin rhetorical tradition. And so, yes, he has this project. It is a project for the elite. The documents we do have, this Vadakkankulam records and Saveriraya Pillai's record, and also this other pseudo community, which I don't know enough about yet, but the Muthuswami Pillai, Saminada Pillai connection, these Catholics from Pondicherry who worked in Madras at the turn of the 19th century. These are all Velalas. And they are, I mean, Pillai can be a title for many castes, but in the title pages that this man of the books that this man printed, there is like Velala Kulam, like very explicitly mentioned. There are other elite groups that might be part of it at very degrees, at very levels, at very many levels. But I think that, of course, all of this would not be accessible to a large number of people. And that's why I insisted on the question of mediation. I mean, he wanted an elite caste which was actually able to mediate at the same time. He didn't only do that. I have worked a little bit on a text of his, on a completely different genre, on a folk ballad genre in Ammane, whom he wrote most likely for Paravars who lived a bit on the inland, and that had the most amazing trajectory in the sense that the text afterwards was, since he wrote it in this genre, but still in a little bit of a too high literary style, communities who wanted to adopt it, because it's a ballad in honor of a saint that they worshipped, actually retranslated it into truly local folk genres, like theater play, etc. So this devotion and this trajectory of his text also exists. This was clearly something targeted not to the same group that I've been talking about today, but yeah, you could see that there was a problem there because the text itself is forgotten. But from that text, very explicitly from that text, we have rewritings that then have been spreading in what we would among fishermen communities. We are not talking about Dalits by any means. The question of there were like all types of groups in the mission at this time. The question of who was targeting whom and how, it's a little bit more complex, but I do think that this was absolutely a training of elites, mostly Velala elites. The second point, yeah, the stolen manuscript. Yeah, of course, stolen or lost manuscripts then reappear and they have some sort of authority. It's very much of a topos. In this case, the text existed by itself, but I do think that it does the story, which is nice in itself and might be somehow have some grain of truth in the sense that perhaps in the 19th century a manuscript of the Ten Bhavani was really donated to the Puri Vinattam church by this Lutheran person. But of course it kind of establishes this man Savarimuttu at the head of a somehow intellectual parampara tradition, and the fact that this manuscript existed, was lost, it reappeared, is definitely part of that as a topos, I think.
Thank you so much, Margherita, for your answer. We can maybe move to Nicolas Belorge's question, if it's fine with you.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Would you like me to read the question? Or would maybe...
I thought it was, okay, no, it's in the chat.
Yeah,
sure.
Well, I'm not specialist of the area, but it was out of curiosity and to make a link with other things about Tamil Nadu.
Yeah, I mean, what I see there is, I guess, with ghost, it's the normal in English translation of pay of this same Tamil word that that I was talking about. It's not possible to translate it as ghost really consistently in the works of Besky, because clearly the figures he's talking about are more complex than Tamil ghosts, in the sense that he's doing there another of these complex layering operations. So there are scenes where these demons are really devils of the Christian tradition. We have a passage inspired by Torquato Tasso, Jerusalem Delivered, in which at the entrance of the Holy Family into Egypt, there is a meeting of the demons with the king of the demons in the underworld, and it's a war meeting. They need to decide what to do, because they don't understand who is invading them. In fact, the whole fact of the invasion is the fact that when Jesus entered Egypt, all the temples fall, etc. So in this case, we have there is all a semantic range for these demons, and it kind of varies. So in this specific canto, he says kunungu, which is a sort of archaic word that mostly refers to a demon. But yes, these are the ghosts. They say the same words for the ghosts which are in Kali's retinue. So the ghosts that eat the brains of the people after the battle, famously in the Kalingattuparani. Same words then that, or the ghosts in this in the tradition that has been mapped by anthropologists. So there is quite famous book by Isabel Nabokov, Religion Against the Self, I think is the title. But it is about possession in Tamil Nadu, and the entities that possess are precisely the same pace. So I think in the poem, what basically is doing is playing with all of these levels. So in certain scenes, we have the same demons who look like biblical or like Newtonian or like demons. Then you do have them looking like pace, so like playing tricks or like fighting. There is a long passage, a long description of a fight between angel and demons, which is really totally inspired by the Kalingattu Parani, in which these demons take the shape of animals. So yes, it's definitely there. That reference, but it's part of this multiple levels of reading.
Wonderful. I think we have 3 more questions from Nicola. Nicola, you have a question, right? Or you were raising your hand? Then Aprajita, and then Shibi Laxman. So maybe Aprajita, would you like to start? Aprajita? Oh, you are going to the mic.
Yeah, I'm here. So I have 2 small questions actually. How did the catechists know what forms of Tamil poetry to emulate, like the rhetorical figures or the kind of play on popular texts that you mentioned? Seem like there is a wider knowledge of subaltern Tamil texts or popular Tamil texts. And the second is, what is the relation of the texts with the state? Like, I am pushing you to make like Sanjay Subramaniam kind of points as to where is the state in all of this, or where is the company in all of this? What is the relationship that the company officials have with these texts? Are they okay with them, or they don't even care? Thanks.
Okay. So the question of what kind of literature catechists could read, it's a question at very many levels. There is even the church actually legiferates on this. And also, in fact, non-Christian books were usually not allowed to normal converts, would not be allowed, but the catechists would be allowed to read them in order to refute them, in order to be able to understand their kind of like peers but opponents in conversations and debates. So there is a certain leeway. They can actually read these texts. Which text exactly they read? There are two parallel answers to this. On the one hand, Beschi, especially in his grammars, does create a canon of good texts of Tamil literature, which are the classics. I mean, Tirukural, Kambaramayanam, Jivaka Sintamani, like the big, some of the big classics of Tamil literature, which are well written, which excel perhaps in one specific stanzaic form. And he suggests the people, his catechists, the readers of this Tamil grammar, to rely on those texts. But and so, I mean, and in his own work too, we can see a certain canon, if you want to say, that is trying to elaborate it. Then there is the big question of Puranic forms of literature, like stories and so on, which were of course like mostly the things missionaries were more afraid of and didn't particularly like. And then there is the whole universe of, let's say, non-elite, non-courtly related forms of literature. And this is a huge part of the literary life of the mission at this time. It's not a part that we can map yet very well, but it's totally the direction in which I'm interested in going, in the sense that this sort of literary practices that are often centered around performance and around genres that have to do with the ballad or with the theater play. These texts have been like not studied at all, mostly, because this type of literature of all, like coming from all types of religious affiliations had received less attention, because these are texts in a sometimes less fixed forms. There are some exceptions, but definitely this type of literature is part of the life of the mission, and also of these catechists, and is part of the cultural production of Catholics in Tamil Nadu. The Catholic elite after Beschi will produce many texts in the genres that Beschi used, and then the other, like the biggest other type of like Catholic literary production is Ammana, which is this specific ballad form which was performed. If we look at the Tamil collection in BNF, for example, I think that like Catholic Natakams and Ammanas are perhaps form the biggest number of Christian manuscripts in Tamil manuscripts in there. So all that word is there for sure, and these usually were texts written on stories of the histories of the saints. And yes, so both aspects are there. As for the relationship between text and state, so well, I mean, I'll see it as the, let's say, relationship between text and political institutions. At this time, in the early 18th century, it's a constellation. So we do have the mission, which is still under Portuguese patronage, and the Portuguese are in Goa, and money come from there, things come from through Goa. But by this point, not as much, not exclusively as before. You have the French in Pondicherry, which are like a crucial reference for the missionaries at this time, especially the first half of the 18th century is also the moment where the French and the English are beginning to actually fight for South India, and then throughout the 18th century we have all of the Carnatic Wars, etc. The English are a little bit less prominent in the specific space the mission is using, is occupying at this time, while the Catholic missionaries are also in Pondicherry. So they do up and down from like the Tamil inland and Pondicherry all the time. And then of course there is the mission as, I mean, there is the Society of Jesus as an institution. Then there are the other religious orders which belong to yet another institution, which is called Propaganda Fide, which is and these are really two different bodies, ultimately going back to the same ultimate head of the Pope, but quite separated, let's say, in Tamil Nadu, where they do have two legs. And finally, there are local kings. So Beschi, for example, was quite keen in looking for patronage from local kings. He got it. In connection with him, we have one of the only 3 inscriptions surviving, Tamil inscriptions surviving, which have to do with Catholic things. One is in Kamanaikan Patti, another one is a copper plate, and the third one is this is a 1734 inscription at Elacurici, where a local small king donates the land of the church in which the church is to the church, to the mission. And so you can see there are all of these institutions is extremely fragmented, but of course missionaries are playing the game and the catechists are playing the game too. It's just a game which changes and switches very quickly. In this specific moment, what is quite interesting is the alliance between Beschi and Chanda Sahib, which is this Mughal warlord, which was an ally of the French, and at some point in 1740 or 41 conquers Trichy, Tiruchirappalli. So yes, Beschi supports him, is supported by him, and so on. So there are switching politics. I mean, there is also, I mean, of course, there is Trankebar, there is the Danish, there is the Dutch. In fact, I had forgotten about it. It's a puzzle, and it's also very interesting to look how they play in all of this. Poetry, and I'll conclude with this, is fundamentally political, in the sense that one reason why being a good poet is important is also because it gets you at some sort of big or small court. And you know, like the relationship between poets and, again, small or big kings, we don't really make the difference, is really key in Tamil Nadu as elsewhere. And definitely Jesuits are good at navigating this in France. We know it from Fumaroli and the whole question of rhetoric, Jesuits, poetry, the French court, whatever. But they are pretty good at this, at least at the time of Beschi, in South India too.
Wonderful. This may be your last question from Shibi Laxman, and then we'll bring this session to an end. Shibi, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah. Do you guys hear me?
Yes, very well.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. I liked it very much. Actually, the way you brought the Catholics, elite mans in the whole idea of transition is one of the important points that Tamil studies has to take for the future. Future research, which is very interesting. My question is, it's not very well, developed, but I'm seeing that the long transition of Tamil modernity starts from 16th century to the 19th century. In between, there are so many actors in it. Start from, let's take it from David Sulman's words, David Sulman's, category of, the 16th century, Tenkasi Renaissance. There are so many natives we have, found out, we have underlined. They are the agents of the change in the modernity. Though the Beschi was played a major role and a kind of a decisive role in changing Tamil language in every sense, his network with muds in the native muds, either a Saivite mud or Vaishnavite muds, or his networks with the muds and his response to the native speakers, because the same period when Tunnul Vilakam came, there are a good number of grammar treaties also emerged. So we have to see it in the larger context of for whom Beschi has a response and for whom he is interacting with. So how to find that kind of a connection? So how to map Beschi in the larger transition to the modernity of Tamil. We have read about that. His role, everything in the missionary point of view. In your presentation, you have mentioned that how Catholic elites have carried forward his work later on, which is exactly right, which we all agree with it. But how to locate him in the larger context? Yeah, that's my question.
Thank you. I had tried, actually, this is somehow the part I partially skipped over in my talk. that is reactions and controversies. It's a tricky question. It's a question I've had for 10 years, and I honestly don't have a clear-cut answer. But there are a few ways of looking at this. The first way is actually literary and very formal. That is, at the time when Beschi writes this huge poem about Christianity in this specific meter, which is Viruttam, etc., and in which he writes the Tonnul Virakam and all of that, as you rightly point out, he's actually kind of copying or perhaps just going with the flow of what people were doing in Tamil Nadu, a little bit everywhere in the mats. So we do have, especially in Shaiva milieux, these centuries are also the centuries in which I think this is an important context. Southern Shaiva Siddhanta got institutionalized into important mats, with the leading caste, which are not very dissimilar from the ones that I've mentioned for Catholics, with a huge production in the same meters, this Viruttam and so on, as Beschi chooses as the excellence for didactic poetry. So this is something that I am actually I've been reflecting on a little bit, the question of how the relation, one way of without looking at history and direct contact that it's difficult to find, but more about it in a second, how thinking in terms of like literature and formal analogies, how using the same type of poetry, how writing the same type of grammars at the same time, how trying to create the same literary institutions actually isn't in fact by itself a conversation. And so this, I think, is something that we can certainly kind of highlight with regard to Beschi's work. You know, his own school at Elakurici, he calls it a mat. So certainly there is something going on there. The second thing is the question of real like controversies or reactions, or like this is what I was mentioning, a history of lost texts. There is a number of works against Christianity that were theoretically written and have not survived. Of one, we have 3 verses. It's the Yesumata Nirakaranam, I think, by Turemangala Shiva Prakasam. 3 verses have survived within the commentary to a work of a student of his, which is called Kolai Maruttal, which is against killing and for vegetarianism. And in the commentary to this work, 3 verses against Christianity, written theoretically in the late 17th century, have been preserved. So, and they come from a Shaiva milieu, from a Vira Shaiva milieu, which is also very interesting because missionaries liked the Vira Shaivas. Protestant missionaries afterwards did too, but Catholics like them too. If it's true that we have like some early works by Nobili that cite several Tamil poems. They did cite quite some Virashaiva works, but this is just to say there is it's a world of fragment through which we can create this connection. But I work by using fragments, but definitely we can look at Beschi from other perspectives. We can look at the 18th century or the 17th century or modernity in like this early modernity in Tamil Nadu. And one angle that I think is very fruitful is precisely to explore this connection between religions that get institutionalized and the role of literature that becomes, which is at the same time poetry and needs to be didactic in this new context, which is true for Shaivas of different types, Vaishnavas of different types, and it's also true for Christians that in their small, tiny dimension of like 1 square kilometer in the Lakurici, which is the one endowment that they had, somehow perhaps are trying to do the same thing. So I would think that this is a very good corrective. We are talking about a drop in the water, but we can look at it from very close. And this is, I think, the perhaps what tells us something.
Thank you so much, Margherita, for answering in such a complete way to all the questions and to the very engaged audience. So what we could do now is to bring this session to a close, and thanking you first and foremost for your kind participation and your great insights. The audience, of course, will reconvene in 15 days with a lecture by Nilesh Bose on South Asian migration. And last but not least, on the behalf of CSH, I would also like to thank Samuel Ben-Kimon, who is our scientific secretary, that has been completely pivotal in organizing all these sessions, and will step down from this heavy duty. So I would like to just say thank you to him on the behalf of all of us. So on that note, let's reconvene in 15 days. Thank you, Margherita, once again, and have a great evening, you all.
Thank you for listening, and see you.